Right. Welcome to our second installment of COVID-19 forced evictions. We are still hosting these discussions with the Forge. And in today's discussion, as I've already mentioned, we are looking at forced removals and focusing on de-densification. Now, though de-densification seems inarguably reasonable under the call of social distancing, the list of ripple effects can be quite long and complex, particularly when there is lack of transparency that accompanies this, and we aren't able to fully predict what these effects might be. Now, this is particularly more complex when we engage on and take account of the historically removals that the state has been involved in. So there is a distrust, particularly amongst people who have this long history of forced removals. So in our discussions today, we're just going to look at what it means for communities and people who are forced to interact with these forced removals. Joining me for this discussion, we have Huchzermeyer and Axolile Notywala. Huchzermeyer is a professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at the Wits University, where she convenes the Master of Urban Studies degree. She is also affiliated to the Center for Urbanism and Built Environment Studies, CUBES, which is hosted in the same School of Architecture and Planning. Her research over the past 2 decades has engaged critically with housing and informal settlement policy. She is the author of the book Cities Without Slums, From Informal Settlement Eradication to a Right to the City in Africa, and a book also entitled Tenement Cities from 19th Century Berlin to 21st Century Nairobi. From this perspective, a theme of her more recent research is situated reading of Henry Lefebvre's work on the right to the city. Mari's work continues to promote the participatory upgrading of informal settlement. She tries to accompany leadership in a few informal settlements that have resisted relocation and are struggling for in-situ upgrading. And she is the voice, she's a voice in discussions on policy and implementation in this field. Thank you for joining us, Mari, and welcome to the discussion.
Thanks, Edward.
Thank you. Also joining me, I have Axolile Notywala. Axolile is an activist and the General Secretary of the Social Justice Coalition, which is a grassroots social movement campaigning for safe, healthy, and dignified communities in some of South Africa's most underdeveloped townships. He is a 2015 alumnus of the Building Bridges Leading in Public Life program, which was hosted by the University of Cape Town. He is also a 2016 Washington Fellow, Mandela Washington Fellow rather, and served from 2012 to 2017 as a board member of the My Vote Counts campaign, which is a non-profit company campaigning to improve the accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness of elections and politics in South Africa. Axolile also serves as a committee member of the South African Human Rights Commission's Section 11 Committee on the Right to Water and Sanitation. Axolile, thank you for joining us and welcome to the discussion.
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you. So maybe just to start us off, I've just given that intro around de-densification and how it was planned to be used as part of the remedies and solutions for the COVID-19 crisis in informal settlements. What is your assessment of this strategy as it applies in this context? I'll start that with you, Marie, and Axolile, you can jump in on the same question.
Yes, okay, thanks very much, Edward. Perhaps I'll take us back to the rationale, or what we understand of the rationale for de-densification as a COVID-19 response from the Department of Human Settlements. Initially, it was really a direct, it seemed to be a direct translation of the issue of needing social distancing. Most of us feel more comfortable with the word physical distancing, and there's a real reason to that. But in the department's wording, social distancing being impossible in certain spaces that are too dense, and therefore one needing to de-densify those environments, and the vehicle for de-densification is the construction of TRAs, temporary location areas, and we've been seeing various of these being constructed as we speak. Quite a lot of PR by the ministry around these de-densification sites. I think there are daily visits to them that are filmed and handed over to the media. It tends to be fairly nice looking Wendy houses, but indeed it is temporary Wendy houses. We found out the cost of them is 60,000 Rand per unit, and that amounts to quite a lot if we're looking at the scale at which this project is being undertaken. So the idea of, with a bird's eye view, identifying 29 very dense settlements and saying this is where we need to repurpose a lot of money to rapidly construct TRAs, temporary location areas, so that people can be de-densified, moved out of these dense areas, and so that they can practice social distancing. You're asking about the assessment of this. So the assessment has been on many levels. The initial critique was around precisely what you've been raising, which is the forced evictions. The response by the department has been, no, this will be voluntary. And we've been seeing in the media statements from the minister spokesperson or by the minister spokesperson saying, no, this will be for the elderly who wish to opt out of dense informal settlements, or for vulnerable people, or actually it's for people that need to self-isolate, or there seems to be a different rationale. At the same time, early on, we were hearing the department thinking about new norms for densities and for what would be appropriate, which seems to be a very rushed response to this pandemic, when we still know very little about how this pandemic will pan out in the longer term, and how technology, as well as all sorts of other mechanisms and management mechanisms, could help. We're already finding that hygiene, there's a lot of discussion around how instead you need to rather put all your effort into better hand washing facilities. What is the use of moving people out of a dense settlement into a TRA where they still have to share a toilet, they still have to share a tap, they still have to probably stand in a queue? If it's about managing that, then you might as well manage that in the settlement, and so on. But that is one level of critique. Another level of critique is precisely around this notion of social distancing, which everyone with a critical angle has been saying, no, it's about physical distancing. We actually need the social proximity. People should not be ripped out of their social networks and their support networks, and actually doing that can lead to negative health outcomes. We know that those health outcomes are also dependent on nutrition, on livelihood, and all of that is also impacted. How close are these TRAs to the actual individuals' direct networks of support and so on, and of solidarity, of reciprocity, and so on. Now, there's another level of assessment, and that relates to, it's a difficult one because it relates to the politics and to the way the state is financing. It relates to things we've learned about our government from the Zondo Commission, which is not a good thing that we've been learning there. I mean, it's been very good to learn these things, but it's a very sad story, and that is that wherever the government puts out big contracts to single contractors, repurposes money, big questions need to be asked, you know. And is this a way of circumventing procurement processes? Is it a way of kickbacks, getting kickbacks? The journalists have done a very good job in poking holes at the sanitation and water side of the National Department of Human Settlements and Water and Sanitation, and did find that the minister's advisors are involved in some other way in her presidential campaign, and her past campaign, might still be owing money from that, might be needing money for the next one, and there were definitely some not so good stories about money being repurposed and possibly siphoned off, and so those are alarm bells that need to be ringing very strongly about this idea of suddenly having an intervention in informal settlements that is actually TRA driven, and that is led by big contracts, big repurposing money contracts, rapidly building TRAs, when in fact it is other departments that are taking care of quarantining sites and of more health-related vulnerabilities and identifying households. You know, that is a whole necessary area of work, but it happens not to fall under human settlements. There's obviously coordination that's needed, so when we ask this question of the Human Settlements Department, whether the de-densification is whether it's why it's driven by TRAs, we were told, no, it's not being driven by TRAs, it's being driven by informal settlement upgrading, and it's the 29 settlements are settlements that are anyway going to be upgraded in situ through the UISP upgrading of informal settlements program under the housing code, and that does occasionally require partial relocation or de-densification or reblocking, but also TRAs, and therefore we need TRAs. Now, if that's the case, then we can only relocate if that is a last resort, and we do need to see the UISP plans. We need evidence that actually the necessary planning has been done that justifies the fact of needing to de-densify, of needing to move people into TRAs, and that there are plans in place for where people will move to from there. And I think that raises a whole lot of questions that are still unanswered. And yes, so maybe I'll stop there.
Correct. Okay, thanks, Marie. Axolile, just to bringing in on the same question, what's your assessment of and take on these plans insofar as a relief measure?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I share a lot of similar concerns, and we share a lot of similar concerns as organizations that continue to work with residents of informal settlements. And I think what we're seeing is a lot. It confirms a lot of what many of us have said with regards to how people living in informal settlements are dealt with and how they are seen by government, local, provincial to national. And it shows the lack of planning for informal settlements that exist within municipalities. And also it shows this sort of reactionary or reactive approach to dealing with issues within informal settlements, because when you don't plan, then you respond in a reactionary approach, because now the response is with regards to COVID-19. And we've seen this type of response with regards to other disasters. We've seen this to floods, we've seen this in response to fires in informal settlements, that as soon as something happens, then government comes in and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And this creates many problems, because then these approaches are imposed to people. There's lack of participation with regards to who is going to go and where the land is, and many other issues. And I think that there remains important questions which some I think Maria has posed with regards to these issues. Basic services, what types of basic services are going to be provided? People need to know these things. Is there going to be water? Is there going to be electricity? Are there going to be enough sanitation services? And also this question around the rationale, because if you are saying you are de-densifying so that there can be sort of physical distancing, then that doesn't necessarily answer the question, that issue with regards to social or physical distancing as it comes to COVID-19. Because again, it's not clear whether the department is going to move people from one house as to lessen the number of people in one house, or they're going to be moving a house. Because if you're going to be moving one household, it still doesn't deal with the issue of physical distancing. You're going to be still leaving many other households that sort of overcrowded. And I think there's that important question and clarification with regards to the two terms of density and overcrowding, because moving a household doesn't deal with overcrowding. You're just moving people because if you're moving a family of 7 people to a TRA, those people are still going to be overcrowded. And so that rationale is important, and it needs to be clear. And whether this is for self-isolation, again, this needs to be clear, because it doesn't answer many questions that people have. And lastly, I think the question around funding is important. Where is this money coming from all of a sudden? Is this money going to be taken out of existing funding for USDG that was going to be used for services elsewhere, or HSDG or UISP? And so these are important questions that the department hasn't answered, hasn't provided clarity. And all these questions, if not answered, are going to make it difficult for the department to do what they plan to do within these communities, because communities are going to have these questions. And without this transparency and these answers, this is likely going to create conflict amongst communities and amongst residents of informal settlements. Okay.
Yeah. And then also, so Mary spoke about some of the temporary relocation places, right? So the TRAs. And it seems that there is an issue there with some of these TRAs. So I just wanted us to unpack a bit on what are some of the challenges that communities or individuals are likely to face in moving into the TRAs. I'll start with you, Axolile.
So I think there's something that needs to be said with regards to this, to the use of some of these terms by our government. What does temporary mean? How long is temporary? Because this does not only speak to like temporary as in communities. We know that many of the municipalities and even different levels of government speak of temporary services as with regards to sanitation, for example. And temporary in many informal settlements that I know in Kailicha means 10 years, means 15 years. And so this is something that needs to be clarified. We know of a specific case within the Western Cape, Blickistop, which was a temporary relocation area, and there are many others. When there was a fire in BM section in Kailicha in 2013, there were some temporary relocation areas. These still remain, and they still don't have the necessary services. And this is an important question because these temporary relocation areas, it's just an expansion of informal settlements that do not have proper basic services, that do not have dignified services, and nothing is done as to properly developing and even providing proper housing for some of these informal settlements.
Now, Mari, how can we, seeing that a lot of these settlements that are driven by the state, which tend to be temporary, but in their working and in how they are situated and in basically how they end up being permanent due to lack of planning for other reasons, and also just people having nowhere to go outside after the temporary relocation area. What, how do you think that we can plan better in the long term? What are some of the mechanisms or avenues that we can explore to plan better in the long term?
Yeah, so yes, I think maybe I can just add a few points on the TRAs.
Sure.
From the Gauteng context or Joburg context, because precisely the among those 29 settlements that have been identified for de-densification, among them are Diepsloot and in Alexandra also Twetla. These are so Diepsloot in the northern part of Johannesburg. Diepsloot, by the way, that part of Diepsloot is a temporary relocation area that was created in 2001 to move people from the informal settlements on the Huchzermeyer River. They're still living in that enormous TRA area. It is such, and they were of course promised housing back then. They were not told that they were going to be living there for 20 years, and they're now being de-densified into TRAs. In Alex Twetla informal settlement, right adjacent to it is Silvertown, which is a small TRA that's been there since 2006. And in fact, the majority of Twetla itself was removed and turned into a TRA in 2015, and this was under an effort to electrify the area and to move people off the flooded parts and so on. It's called a reblocking, and people have since then lived in the Twetla TRA, and they've responded to this temporariness in a very interesting way. They've all built brick structures around their tiny little units, and in fact, Twetla looks like a favela in Brazil. It has 2-story little, tiny, one room to room, one room above the other, and it's in a way has really improved the indoor quality of that settlement, and people are understanding that these TRAs are in fact permanent, and I think it's a very, very interesting response. They have electricity. They still have to go to the street where all the chemical toilets are lined up. But that's not to say that South Africa couldn't be looking to Brazil on how to upgrade even sanitation in an in-situ situation like this. In fact, that part of Alex is far less overcrowded than other parts, than other informal settlements that I know of. And so we have to be very worried about dotting our landscape with TRAs that remain permanent, that ultimately people start sort of turning into something permanent by building better structures. The only really temporary TRA that I know of was the one built for Protea South, in which the Protea South residents refused to be relocated to. I think it was built in 2006 and it was on leased land, and the lease expired after 3 years and it had to be demolished, unused. A huge waste of funding. But that was a temporary relocation area indeed. But it was temporary because people refused to move there in the first place. And I think that might need to be some of the response in what we're seeing at the moment. I'm just saying that in case community members are listening and kind of also trying to make sense of how one deals with these situations. But your question was how to plan better. And so in situ upgrading is not really disaster driven, but it is a planned process. And if, as we are told, all of these settlements do have already in situ upgrading plans in place, that does mean that there has to, and in situ upgrading, by the way, has to be fully inclusive. You can't say, oh, there's a number of non-South Africans in the settlement that don't qualify for housing. We have to remove them. We put them into a TRA. That, by the way, is a way that, especially City of Cape Town, I understand, and Axolile could confirm that, has been using TRAs as a way to park the people that don't qualify for a subsidy, to park them indefinitely because they don't quite know what to do with them. The upgrading of informal settlement is not driven by whether or not people qualify for housing. Housing construction is phase 4, and those that do qualify would get housing support in that phase. But the other phases have to do with sanitation, with land tenure and planning, and that incorporates everybody. Whether or not you get a title deed at the end of the day might depend on whether you are a qualifier in the sense of the housing subsidy. But proper planning would mean that in this plan there is a long-term, there is a plan in place for every household in terms of where they will be ultimately moved. A TRA could be used in an in situ upgrade to temporarily move some households out of the way to make space for a rearrangement, if that is what the participatory planning has come up with and has found necessary, and to then move them back. If a relocation is needed, as in there's not enough space in that settlement to rearrange and still accommodate everybody, then a permanent housing solution has to be in place, a permanent settlement solution. It could possibly be a service site nearby, adjacent, but there would be no real reason to move people into a TRA because it could just as well be a place where people can start settling on a permanent basis. And in all instances, one should try and move to that. And I would say TRAs have to be a last resort. And even under the UISP, my reading of it is that TRAs indeed should be a last resort. You are relocating. Moving someone to a TRA is a relocation. And the upgrading of informal settlements program, which I understand is still binding even if municipalities are using a USDG or the other grants directly from Treasury for this, the principle still applies that all other possibilities have to have been exhausted before you resort to moving someone, whether to a TRA or to a permanent site, and to a TRA as a very last resort, I would say. I want to add to that the cost of a TRA, because in a UISP that would come out of the budget for the UISP. The temporary provision of all of these services is not cheap. For instance, if it involves chemical toilets, those have to be rented on a daily basis or monthly basis. They have to be cleaned twice a week. The maintenance cost is very high. If it's a water tank, we're hearing from City of Cape Town, that was in the press apparently this week, how much it costs the city to hire tanks or trucks that are able to bring water to these tanks. A huge maintenance cost. Upfront, spending that same money upfront in capital costs of a permanent sanitation and water system is always a better way of spending that money. And I think these questions have to be asked. Are we using this disaster just to give big contracts to more companies to do more TRAs, to do more chemical toilets, to do more water tanks, JoJo tanks, when that money should long have been spent in permanent services, but could also be spent in permanent services. And I think our engineers have not given us the solutions yet as to how to do this rapidly. Our planners haven't, or the planning framework hasn't as yet allowed us really to do a rapid planning approach for informal settlements. It's a big challenge with in situ upgrading that we are still assuming we have to use the regular planning system, which actually doesn't accommodate in situ upgrading, and is a huge hurdle in that process. It's one reason why we keep being told any in situ upgrading can take up to 10 years to implement. Yes, so I think better planning is a very good key phrase to apply here. Of course, it doesn't help us immediately in this COVID situation. It is a disaster situation. It's a declared disaster situation. That, of course, gives the government the powers to do some things differently, and including procurement, including repurposing funding within its budget. So it is able to do that now, and that's where we have to be a little bit worried and a little bit cautious about, specifically about jumping to TRAs. Of course, there are people that are saying, oh, yes, please, that will be a relief of our situation. And I don't want to deny at all that living conditions in many informal settlements is really in itself a disaster, permanent disaster situation, being afraid of fire every night, having to go out, risk your personal safety by going out to a communal toilet at night. All these are not normal and good situations at all. But what we're saying is that TRA is not really the right solution.
We're running out of time.
Sorry.
But I just want to, for the sake of our viewers who might not be familiar with all these terms, UISP, USDG, all of those things. Actually, if I could just ask you to give like a short intro, 1 minute, on what is this UISP and what does it seek to achieve?
Sure. So yeah, the UISP is the Upgrading of Informal Settlements program, which was introduced by national government, which in many cases is supposed to be implemented by municipalities. It prioritizes a number of things. One, that communities must be involved in their own development, which is participation. It prioritizes security of tenure, that people need to have to be secure in where they are. How that is defined in different communities would be different. As Mari had said, that it has different phases, and it prioritizes, I would say, dignity as it comes to basic services that people need to have, water, sanitation, and electricity, while they are waiting for formal break houses. They need to be living in dignified house. So it's mainly some of those things that the UISP prioritizes. And TRAs are temporary relocation areas. And many of the times we refer to them as so-called temporary relocation areas, because the temporariness of them is very problematic in how we know has been implemented.
Right. I think maybe just closing remarks from both of you on what do you think the state should be doing better, in as far as, I think you can frame it broadly, in as far as informal settlements are concerned, in terms of their living situation, or you can frame it a bit more narrowly in the response to this current crisis. So I'll just leave it up to you to choose which one of the two you want to address, but just do it in as brief as possible, that you can. I'll start with you, Axolile.
Yeah, so I think to say again, I think this raises questions that have been raised before, numerous questions that have been raised before. This is not a new approach from government. And for me, I think, as we've always said, that the problem comes when, for a number of years, people living in informal settlements or informal settlements continue to be seen as temporary. And therefore, there's no prioritization for investing in informal settlements. And therefore, the reactionary approach when disasters arrive. We need to start recognizing that informal settlements, as informal as they are permanent. And we need to start seeing people living in informal settlement as part of our cities. They are residents belonging to our cities. And when we start recognizing that, then we'll start treating people as people and involving them in planning processes and participation processes.
Thank you. Marie?
Edward, I was listening so intensely to Axolile. Won't you repeat your question?
So it's, yes, so what do you think the state should be doing better in response, whether informal settlements or the current crisis?
Yes, so yes, thanks. What I think, in addition to everything Axolile has said, which was, I think, completely spot on, I think what is needed is coordination. So in recognizing informal settlements as permanent, a response the state needs to take is to really coordinate its involvement in these settlements. And that means ensuring that it knows who lives in them and how they are organized, who to speak to in them, and to coordinate its presence, and whether that means through the collection of refuse, through finding out what is missing, and if it's taps, if it's toilets that are not regularly cleaned, all of that needs to be coordinated properly. All informal settlements ought to have a disaster mitigation plan in place. It's required under our Disaster Management Act. There needs to be a preparedness for all manner of situations. And if that had been in place, we would not be now talking about TRAs. We would be saying, aha, there's a disaster looming, and let's quickly put our heads together and think through what is really needed. And mostly the settlements, the people living in the settlements themselves would have come up with some very pragmatic and useful suggestions of what is needed. And it might really be, there's 20 taps, but only 5 are working. Please immediately fix the others. No, we don't need a water tank. Please just dig a trench and put in, extend 10 more taps. And real concrete things that I'm aware that in some communities there are on the ground initiatives. They're not being supported by the state; they're being supported by NGOs, by individuals, and so on. But I do think that unless we get that right, and we get government speaking to the right people in informal settlements, to speaking to people in general, and it's the big point about participation that Axolile made as well. And I think it's a matter of being prepared for that participation on a permanent basis as well, and having that institutionalized into structures that that function at all times, I think is really important.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Axolile. So, I think just thank you both for participating in this discussion. I think we'll leave it there for today. So, yeah, I think you both have provided very insightful comments and useful suggestions for how we can move forward in, I think, having a more prolonged and better planned in interjection and approach to informal settlements. Yeah, I think so. This is where we'll end it. My name is Molopi, Research and Advocacy Officer at the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, and these discussions are brought to you by The Forge.
Thank you.